Hey friends, I um, I find every once in a while that something I'm struggling with will almost magically transform into some kind of blessing. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but over and over again, it's like the thing that I think is blocking me from satisfaction, from success, from just feeling like I'm making progress, whatever the goal happens to be, the thing that is in the way will almost like it's like a, if you imagine like a translucent prism, or a crystal, a rock, a sheet of glass, something that you can partly see through, and as I'm looking through it, it makes the world look a certain color or a certain way, or there's a certain pattern that's being projected on reality that this lens or this thing is creating. And then I move, and all of a sudden I'm not looking through it anymore. I'm looking at it, or I'm looking at it from a slightly different angle than I was before. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, actually, this thing is the thing that is helping me right now. It goes almost at the drop of a hat from being the thing that feels like it's a thorn in my side to being the thing that is a wind at my back, a wind in my sails, right? Something that is elevating me, informing me, supporting me, even without my knowing it. And whenever this happens, it's such a relief. It's such a relief. And I truly believe that it's totally possible to become so conscious, so present, that we always perceive anything that might be a perceived obstruction as being precisely that, as being a gift, a tailwind, a form of divine assistance. I am not there yet. I will tell you when I get there. I will sing from the hilltops when I get to the point that I never perceive the obstruction as just being an obstruction. And I always recognize the obstruction for what it really is, which is a gift and a form of assistance. But in the meantime, I get to have the experience of thinking that something is a problem, is an obstruction, is some sort of limitation, and then being pleasantly surprised when it turns out that actually that thing is a blessing. And that's it's something that manifests in so many different ways. It's really hard to pin it down in my life. It's as you can probably tell from the way I'm describing it, it's a pretty universal principle. This could happen in our professional life, in our personal life, in our intimate life, in our family life. It could happen anywhere. It could be any kind of thing that feels like it's a problem with the right shift in perspective, transforms into a blessing. And sometimes, I've been speaking quite a bit in the last week or two about working with my young daughter on her violin practice. And one of the things that happened recently, and partly the reason I've been talking about it a lot, is that it's been a wonky time. It's been, she was kind of sick a lot before Christmas break. Then we had Christmas break. Then she immediately got sick after Christmas break. So we've had this kind of 3 different periods where she was home more than usual, and as a result, our schedule was pretty unstructured. We haven't had our rhythm for quite a while. And what that often means, as far as her musical practice goes, is that things just aren't as steady as they are when we're in an actual rhythm. It's not that we don't do the work, and it's not that she doesn't make amazing progress. It's just that things are a little more stutter step, and it feels like more of a surprise. Getting into something and having it be hard all of a sudden feels like, oh, I don't want to do something hard, especially in the middle of Christmas break, right? It's a lot harder to convince somebody to put down the joy of just the all day, every day party that life is when you're a 5-year-old on Christmas break and practice than it is when it's in the context of getting up every day and going to school and then having maybe an after-school activity or maybe just a little bit of after-school playtime and then having dinner and going to bed. And it's just kind of a steady rhythm that's consistent and starts to be predictable. So anyway, I've been talking a lot about this because it's something that has been a little wonky lately. And this morning I was listening to my wife and I had our coffee date, our weekly coffee date, and we got to talk a little bit about where our daughter is. We just get to kind of check in about where life is. And one thing that I had already observed before the coffee date was that the morning after we did our violin practice, she was completely stonewalling Katie about they do a little playtime session in the morning, and she was completely refusing to let that go. She was refusing to come to breakfast. She was refusing to eat her breakfast once she got to breakfast. She was refusing to get ready for school. As soon as it was time to get ready for school, she was all of a sudden very enthusiastic about eating her breakfast, and it was always just everything was a no, I want to do this instead. And I was so it's not just violin practice, is it? It's literally everything right now. So that's kind of a relief, because as the musician parent who's so invested in my child's musical development, I'm always, trying to check myself for am I pushing this? Is the reason that she's resisting because of the way I'm going about it? Am I creating enough space for her to do this have her own volition involved here? And when I recognize that the resistance that I experience when we're practicing is actually just exactly the same as it is to all of the things she's being asked to do right now, then I'm oh, well, at least it's not me, and at least it's not music. It's just where she is. So that's a relief. And then I'm I listen to a lot of parents talk about how hard it is to work with kids at this age for whatever. They're at an age where part of their growth is testing limits, testing boundaries, stonewalling and saying no to see what happens, to see how your parents react or how authority figures react when you refuse to cooperate or refuse to do what they ask. It's part of what their learning is about at this age, is figuring out how those consequences work, where those boundaries actually are. Are these boundaries real? If I kick this boundary, will it move? Will I stub my toe on it? Will it lash out at me? You know, they're learning what it means to kind of walk around life and kick the tires and see what happens. And I talk to parents about this, and I hear about, you know, how hard it is to get them moving in the morning, how hard it is to get them dressed, how they just go in, they say no to everything, whatever the activity happens to be, they say no. And then I'm like, well, you know, violin is a pretty high bar. Musical practice is a relatively high bar, especially for a young age. I mean, at any age really, but especially at a young age, it's a very complex, intricate process. So it's a high bar, but if they're going to say no to everything, why not set the bar high? Right? Like, if they're going to say no, whether you put the bar low or high, let's set the bar high. It's the same. You're having the same fight, or you're not necessarily fight, but you're having the same. You're going to encounter the same level of resistance, whether you ask for very little or whether you ask for a great deal. So I was like, my takeaway from that was like, well, let's set the bar high. See what happens. What's the, you know, if I'm essentially signing on for the same experience, at least until, you know, this is a phase, until this phase of probably however a couple many weeks, you know, until this moves into the next phase. But if this is where we are, then why not set the highest standard that's available to us? And this was one of these instances of realizing that the obstacle that I was encountering is actually kind of a gift, because it frees me from the delusion that there's anything wrong in the resistance, or that there's anything wrong in the process simply because there's resistance. And this is a lesson I've also learned in my own experience any number of times, right? It's vogue right now, at least in certain circles, to feel like we should feel like we're in flow. We want to be in flow, in the zone. We want to be locked in alignment, right? All these things are true. But if I know anything about the creative process, it's that the creative process always involves friction. It involves periods where progress feels very swift, and periods where progress feels incredibly slow, if not non-existent, and we even might feel like we're experiencing regression rather than progress. And if we're attached to the idea that the creative process is about being in flow, or about feeling like we're in flow, then anytime that's not happening, or anytime we're not getting that feeling, we're going to think something's wrong. And that is not true. That is not true. Nothing is wrong. We're just in one of the inevitable phases of growth that involves things not moving as much right now. I mean, you wouldn't say that an oak tree is only good at being an oak tree in the summertime and that it's deficient at being an oak tree in the wintertime because it's not producing any leaves or any acorns. That would be insane. You would be clearly like not informed about how the rhythm of the natural world works. Or like the moon sucks at being the moon when it's a new moon, and it's really good at being a moon when it's full moon. What? What are you like, what are you talking about? That's nonsense. But we experience the waxing and waning in our own creativity, in our own flow, actually kind of like that. That is sort of how we think about it. Like when we're really moving and doing and feels like, yeah, I'm vibing, I've got juices are flowing, things are happening, then I feel good. When it's not happening, when there's less, I have less energy, I'm making less movement, whatever, then it's not as good. I'm not as good. It's not as good. I'm not as good at this. Maybe I should quit. Right? But those things are equally insane. Like, that's just as crazy as saying that an oak tree is not a good oak tree in the wintertime. It's just that it's more it's kind of like makes it very cartoon and very like obvious when we take an object like that in the natural world that we know has a rhythm to it and that we're not invested in it. Like, we don't really care whether the oak tree is producing it. It's not like our emotions get torn apart when the oak tree has to go into hibernation because it's wintertime. But if our creative process has to go into hibernation because it's our wintertime, or if a project has to go into a period of dormant incubation, that can be devastating. That can be destabilizing. So it's just nice to recall that sometimes those obstacles, I mean, I would essentially say all the time, but let's take some baby steps here. Those what feel like the obstacles are actually the gift, are actually the thing that is creating that shift in perspective so that we can move to a new level. It's very empowering and it's like a nice way to de-stress, to recognize that and truly own that, truly let that be okay. So that is my practice on any number of levels right now. That's where I am today, people. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you soon.